First contact. The observation deck of Research Station Epsilon 7 offered the best view of the Andromeda Nebula in human-controlled space, but Dr. Nova Chen wasn't there for the stellar scenery. Her attention was fixed on the approaching Ashari vessel, its crystalline hull refracting starlight in mesmerizing patterns. After 3 years of studying alien biology on this remote outpost, this would be her first direct contact with the mysterious warrior race. Dr. Chen, the Ashari delegation will dock in 5 minutes, the station's AI announced. Nova straightened her uniform, checking her reflection in the reinforced viewport. At 32, she was young for a lead xenobiologist, but her groundbreaking work on interspecies symbiosis had earned her this position. Thank you, Araya. Is the containment lab prepared? Affirmative. Though I must remind you that the Ashari representatives' companion has caused significant concern among the station's security personnel. Nova smiled. She'd read every scrap of data about the Ashari's symbiotic partners. Where others saw monsters, she saw evolutionary marvels. They're just nervous about the unknown. That's why we're here, to understand. The airlock cycled with a soft hiss. Nova turned to face her visitors, and her breath caught in her throat. The Ashari warrior who entered was striking. Tall and lithe, with iridescent scales that shifted from deep purple to midnight blue. But it was her companion that made Nova's scientific mind race with possibilities. Living darkness. That's how other species describe the Ashari's symbiotic partners. The being that moved beside the warrior seemed to absorb light itself, its edges rippling like ink in water. Most humans would have recoiled. Nova took a step forward. Welcome to Epsilon 7. I'm Dr. Nova Chen. She performed the traditional Ashari greeting, pressing her right hand to her heart and extending her left, palm up. The warrior's silver eyes widened slightly at the gesture. I am Kira Valthor, third blade of the Northern Reach. Her voice carried a melodic quality that the translation matrix couldn't quite smooth out. And this is, she hesitated, glancing at her companion. Your symbiotic partner, Nova finished. It's an honor to meet you both. The darkness shifted, tendrils of void stretching toward Nova with obvious curiosity. Kira tensed, but Nova remained still, her expression open and fascinated. The tendril stopped just short of her outstretched hand. You're not afraid, Kira stated, confusion evident in her tone. Should I be? Your partner is one of the most sophisticated examples of bioquantum evolution we've ever encountered. The way it manipulates dark matter at a cellular level is extraordinary. Nova's eyes sparkled with genuine enthusiasm. I have so many questions, if you're willing to share. A sound like distant chimes emerged from the darkness. Laughter, Nova realized with delight. Kira's rigid posture relaxed slightly. In all my travels, I've never met anyone who responded to shadow this way. Most species can barely look at them, let alone appreciate their beauty. Shadow. Nova smiled. Is that their name? It's the closest translation. In our language, their name means the space between stars where new light is born. Kira's hand absently stroked through Shadow's darkness, the void parting like water around her scaled fingers. You truly see them differently. I see them clearly, Nova corrected gently. Evolution created something magnificent here. The fact that your people learned to form bonds with such extraordinary beings speaks volumes about both species. Shadow rippled again, more of their mass flowing toward Nova. This time, Kira didn't tense. The tendril of darkness finally made contact with Nova's palm, and her scientific detachment momentarily faltered. The sensation was unlike anything she'd experienced, cool but not cold, solid yet flowing, and thrumming with an energy that made her nerve endings sing. Remarkable, she breathed. They're processing quantum information through direct cellular contact. The theoretical applications for medical science alone are. She caught herself and smiled apologetically at Kira. Sorry, I get excited about new discoveries. To her surprise, Kira smiled back. a subtle expression that nonetheless transformed her warrior's facade. Your enthusiasm is refreshing. Most humans we encounter either fear Shadow or wish to weaponize their abilities. Then they're fools who don't deserve such knowledge. Nova's voice carried a sharp edge that seemed to please both her visitors. Science should serve life, not destroy it. That's why I requested this collaboration. To understand and preserve, not to exploit. Shadow withdrew from her hand, but remained closer than before, their darkness weaving patterns in the space between Nova and Kira. The Ashari warrior studied Nova with new interest. Perhaps, she said slowly, this exchange will be more valuable than either of our peoples anticipated. I hope so. Nova gestured toward the corridor. Would you like to see the labs? I've prepared several experiments that might interest you both, focusing on non-invasive observation and voluntary participation only. As they walked, Nova noticed how Shadow seemed to flow between her and Kira, occasionally brushing against them both. The warrior's earlier wariness had evolved into curious glances at Nova whenever Shadow displayed particular interest in the human scientist. They reached the lab, its pristine white surfaces reflecting the strange beauty of Shadow's darkness. Nova began explaining her research protocols, but her mind was already racing ahead to the possibilities this unprecedented collaboration might unlock. For the first time, someone was viewing Shadow as more than a weapon or a horror, as the extraordinary being they truly were. What she didn't yet realize was that this meeting would change far more than just scientific understanding. In the space between stars where new light is born, sometimes the greatest discoveries are not about science at all, but about the hearts that dare to see beauty in the dark. The next few hours passed in a blur of scientific discovery and cultural exchange. Nova's careful preparations proved unnecessary as Shadow enthusiastically participated in every scan and test she proposed, their curiosity matching her own. Kira watched with growing amazement as her usually reserved partner engaged so openly with the human scientist. They've never been this interactive with outsiders, Kira admitted as Shadow demonstrated their ability to phase through solid matter, a display that had Nova practically bouncing with excitement. Even among our own people, Shadow tends to be selective about who they trust. Nova looked up from her readings, catching something vulnerable in Kira's expression. They chose you, didn't they? That's not common, even among the Ashari. Kira's silver eyes widened. How did you know? The way you interact, the subtle differences in Shadow's molecular structure compared to recorded data of other symbiotes. They've adapted specifically to your biology, at a level I've never seen before. Nova's voice softened. It's beautiful, actually. True symbiosis is rare enough between simple organisms. What you and Shadow have, it's extraordinary. A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the soft hum of lab equipment and the melodic sounds Shadow made as they continued their enthusiastic exploration of the facility. Nova found her attention increasingly drawn to Kira. The way the warrior's stoic facade softened when she watched Shadow, the subtle shifts of her iridescent scales in the lab's bright light, the growing warmth in her silver eyes when their gazes met. Science had always been Nova's passion, her driving force. But for the first time in her career, she felt herself equally fascinated by someone, beyond pure research. As Shadow danced between them, bridging the space between human and Ashari, Nova wondered if perhaps she wasn't the only one making unexpected discoveries on this remarkable day. Breaking barriers. 2 weeks into the Ashari delegation's stay on Epsilon 7, Nova found herself working later and later into the station's artificial night cycle. The official reason was the wealth of data Shadow and Kira provided for her research. The unofficial reason sat across from her in the dimly lit lab, silver eyes intent on a holographic display of Shadow's molecular structure. Your cellular density has increased by 12%, Nova noted, adjusting the display's resolution. Shadow, currently wrapped around Kira's shoulders like a living cloak, rippled with interest. The adaptation to our station's gravity happened faster than I expected. They adapt quickly to protect their chosen partners, Kira said, reaching up to brush her fingers through Shadow's darkness. Though I've never seen them so eager to demonstrate their abilities before. Nova smiled, trying to ignore the way her pulse quickened when Kira's scales shifted color in response to Shadow's touch. Scientific curiosity must be universal. Shadow seems to enjoy understanding themselves as much as I enjoy studying them. A tendril of darkness extended across the lab table, gently tapping the display controls. The hologram shifted to show a comparison between Shadow's structure now and 2 weeks ago. Nova leaned forward, fascinated. They're teaching us. Look at these pattern changes. They're not random adaptations. Shadow is deliberately showing us how they modify their quantum state. You see so much that others miss, Kira observed quietly. Even among my people, Shadow is often viewed as a weapon first, a being second. But you, she trailed off, her scales flickering with colors Nova hadn't seen before. Before Nova could respond, the lab's communication system crackled to life. Dr. Chen, priority message from Earth Command, Araya announced. Admiral Rogers requests immediate contact. Nova frowned. Late-night calls from Command were rarely good news. I should take this. Would you mind? Of course. Kira stood, shadow flowing around her like liquid night. We'll continue tomorrow. Definitely. There's still so much to learn. Nova watched them leave, admiring how Kira's warrior's grace complemented Shadow's fluid movements. Once they were gone, she activated the secure channel. Admiral Rogers, this is Dr. Chen. The Admiral's hologram flickered to life, his expression grim. Doctor, we have a situation. The Ashari High Council is demanding an immediate end to your research program. They're claiming you're attempting to weaponize their symbiote's abilities. What? That's absurd. My work is purely focused on understanding their biology and improving human-Ashari relations. Shadow participates voluntarily in every test. Shadow. Rogers raised an eyebrow at the familiar term. Doctor, need I remind you that maintaining professional distance is crucial in these situations? Nova bristled. With all due respect, Admiral, that professional distance is exactly why we've made so little progress in understanding the Ashari and their partners. Shadow isn't just a test subject. They're an intelligent being making their own choices. Choices that could compromise station security. We've received reports of the symbiote accessing restricted areas. Shadow is curious. They're learning about us, just as we're learning about them. If you could see how they interact with our systems, how they process and share information. Nova took a breath, forcing herself to remain calm. Admiral, we're on the verge of breakthrough discoveries that could benefit both species. The Ashari don't seem to share your enthusiasm. They're sending a delegation to escort their warrior and her partner back to their territory. They arrive in 3 days. Nova's heart sank. 3 days. But we've barely scratched the surface of what we could learn from each other. I'm sorry, Doctor. Sometimes the political reality outweighs scientific potential. Rogers out. The lab fell silent. Nova stared at her research displays, the familiar patterns of Shadow's quantum structure now seeming like a countdown to loss. She hadn't realized how much she'd come to value not just the scientific discoveries, but the quiet moments with Kira, watching Shadow's playful interactions, learning the subtle languages of scales and darkness. A soft chime at the lab door pulled her from her thoughts. Kira stood there, Shadow coiled tensely around her. You heard, Nova said. It wasn't a question. Word travels fast, even on a space station. Kira moved closer, her usual fluid grace hampered by obvious tension. Nova, what they're saying about your research is wrong, Nova finished firmly. But it doesn't matter. Fear always speaks louder than truth. She laughed bitterly. Humans and Ashari aren't so different in that regard. Shadow suddenly surged forward, spreading across the lab table between them. Instead of their usual flowing patterns, they formed distinct shapes. Mathematical equations, molecular structures, star charts. They're showing us everything we've learned together. Kira translated, her voice tight with emotion. "Everything that proves the value of what we're doing here." Nova reached out, letting her fingers trail through Shadow's displays. The familiar cool energy of their touch carried a new resonance. Determination, defiance, hope. 3 days, she murmured. 3 days to prove that understanding is more powerful than fear. Kira's hand found hers amid Shadow's swirling patterns. The warrior's scales blazed with colors Nova had never seen in any xenobiological database. "Then we better make them count." Shadow enveloped their joined hands, their darkness somehow warmer than before. In that moment, Nova realized that breaking barriers between species wasn't just about scientific discovery. Sometimes it was about the courage to reach across the void and trust that what waited in the darkness was not something to fear, but something to cherish. As they began planning their defense of the project, Nova caught Kira watching her with an intensity that had nothing to do with scientific curiosity. Shadow's patterns shifted between them, no longer just data displays, but something more complex, more meaningful. Nova might not know all the colors of Kira's emotions yet, but she was starting to understand that some discoveries change more than just scientific understanding. They had 3 days to prove that fear shouldn't drive their peoples apart. 3 days to show that the real breakthrough wasn't in the data or the experiments, but in the trust that had grown between human, Ashari, and the remarkable being they called Shadow. 3 days to demonstrate that sometimes the greatest scientific discoveries come not from studying life, but from living it. The storm breaks. The attack came without warning during Epsilon 7's night cycle. Nova was in the lab, reviewing data with Kira and Shadow, when the station's alarms screamed to life. The lights shifted to emergency red, casting strange shadows that Shadow instantly absorbed, their darkness becoming more alert and focused. "Multiple unauthorized breaches detected," Araya announced. "Unknown vessels have penetrated our defensive perimeter." Kira's scales shifted to battle-ready chromatics, her entire posture changing from scientist's companion to warrior. "Those are Ashari ships," she said, studying the tactical display. "But not from my clan. These are Crimson Void Raiders." Nova's fingers flew across the console, initiating emergency protocols. Raiders, what would they want with a research station? "Not what." Kira's voice was grim. "Who?" "They're here for Shadow. Their clan has been trying to capture and replicate symbiote abilities for decades." Shadow coiled protectively around them both, their darkness hardening into something more crystalline. Nova felt their familiar cool touch, now thrumming with defensive energy. "The research data," she realized. "We've mapped more of Shadow's abilities than anyone before, and they'll kill everyone on this station to get it." Kira drew a ceremonial blade from her belt, its edge glowing with contained energy. "We need to evacuate your people." The station shuddered as the raiders breached another section. Nova activated the emergency channels. "This is Dr. Chen. All personnel proceed to emergency evacuation pods." "This is not a drill. Security teams, protect the evacuation routes." "Nova." Kira grabbed her arm as she moved to leave the lab. "You should go with them." "Like hell." Nova met those silver eyes steadily. "My research brought this danger here. I'm not abandoning you or Shadow." Shadow surged between them, their patterns shifting rapidly. "They agree with me," Kira translated, though her scales betrayed conflicting emotions. "You've never seen combat." "No, but I've spent weeks studying Shadow's quantum abilities." Nova pulled up a station schematic. "The Raiders don't know we've modified these sections with quantum-resonant materials. If we can lure them in." A massive explosion rocked the station. Through the lab's reinforced windows, they saw an Ashari warship emerge from hyperspace, sleek, deadly, and bristling with weapons. "The Crimson Void flagship," Kira breathed. "Their first blade leads this raid personally. Then let's give them a welcome they won't forget." Nova's fingers danced across the console, rerouting power and sealing sections of the station. "Shadow, remember how we mapped your phase-shifting abilities? How you can manipulate quantum fields?" Shadow's darkness rippled with understanding. Their form expanded, covering the lab's walls and equipment in a layer of living void. Kira watched with wide eyes as delicate instruments began to float, suspended in Shadow's quantum manipulation field. "You weaponized their abilities after all," she said softly. "No." Nova shook her head firmly. "I understood them. There's a difference. Shadow chooses how to use their gifts. I just helped them understand the full scope of what they could do." The station rocked again as raiders breached the outer lab section. Shadow pulled back slightly, concentrating their darkness around Nova and Kira. Through the doors, they heard the heavy footsteps of approaching troops. "Last chance to evacuate," Kira said, raising her blade. Nova pulled up one final command sequence. "Shadow has been teaching me too, you know. About trust, about seeing beyond fear." She met Kira's gaze. "I'm exactly where I need to be." The lab doors exploded inward. Crimson-armored Ashari warriors poured through, led by a towering figure whose scales rippled with blood-red patterns. The first blade of the Crimson Void clan. "Kira Valthor," he rumbled, "surrender your symbiote and the humans' research, and we may let some of this station's crew survive." Kira stepped forward, blade raised. "You never understood, First Blade. Shadow isn't a weapon to be claimed. They're a being who chooses their own path. Then you choose death." The First Blade raised his weapon, but froze as Shadow suddenly expanded, their darkness filling the lab with impossible geometries. Nova's voice cut through the chaos. "Now, Shadow, show them what true symbiosis means." The darkness erupted. Every piece of equipment Shadow had touched began to vibrate at quantum frequencies Nova had helped them discover. The raiders' weapons shorted out as Shadow phased through them, destroying their power cores with precise quantum manipulation. Kira moved like liquid night, her blade dancing in perfect synchronization with Shadow's attacks. But it was Nova who delivered the true surprise. When the First Blade charged her, Shadow's darkness flowed through her just as it did through Kira. Instead of fear, Nova felt only exhilaration as she phased through his attack, her understanding of Shadow's quantum abilities allowing her to move in ways no human should. "Impossible," the First Blade growled, staggering back. "No human can bond with a symbiote." "I never tried to bond with Shadow," Nova corrected, letting the darkness flow around her like a protective cocoon. "I try to understand them, to see them as they truly are." She smiled as Shadow's patterns rippled with approval. "That's something your clan never bothered to do." The battle that followed would be talked about for years in both human and Ashari space. Shadow, empowered by Nova's scientific insights and Kira's warrior skills, demonstrated abilities that left the raiders in awe. They didn't just fight, they transformed the very space around them, using the quantum-resonant materials Nova had installed to create localized fields that trapped and disabled their attackers. When it was over, the First Blade and his raiders found themselves contained in a quantum field they couldn't break, their weapons useless, their ship disabled by Shadow's precise manipulation of its drive systems. Nova stood between her two companions, the Ashari warrior and the living darkness that had chosen them both in different ways. She was disheveled, her lab coat torn, but her eyes shone with triumph and something deeper. "You risked everything," Kira said quietly, her scales shifting through colors Nova had learned to recognize as wonder and affection. "Your career, your life. Some things are worth the risk." Nova reached out, letting her fingers intertwine with Kira's as Shadow wrapped around them both. "Some people, too." Understanding darkness. The aftermath of the Crimson Void raid left Epsilon 7 scared but standing. As Nova surveyed the damaged lab, Shadow's darkness helped lift debris while Kira coordinated with station security. The captured raiders were secured in the station's quantum containment cells, their fate to be decided by both human and Ashari authorities. "Admiral Rogers will be arriving within the hour," Araya announced, along with the Ashari High Council delegation. Nova sighed, running a hand through her disheveled hair. Perfect timing. Nothing like explaining a raid, unauthorized quantum experiments, and unprecedented symbiotic interactions all at once. You regret it? Kira asked softly, her scales shifting in patterns that Nova now recognized as concern. Never. Nova smiled, watching Shadow playfully reconstruct a damaged molecular scanner. Though I might regret not documenting Shadow's quantum field manipulation better, the scientific implications alone. Dr. Chen. Araya's voice held an unusual note of urgency. The HFY vessel is arriving ahead of schedule. They're bringing their own symbiotes. Shadow suddenly stilled, their darkness condensing into tight, defensive patterns. Kira's hand went to her blade. How many? 3. All bonded to High Council warriors. Nova felt her heart sink. One shadow was enough to unsettle most beings. 3 more, likely controlled by warriors who viewed them as weapons rather than partners, could mean disaster. They're coming to take Shadow, Kira said grimly. After what happened with the Raiders, they'll see them as too dangerous to leave with a single warrior, especially one who allows human interaction. Shadow flowed between them, their patterns forming complex equations, the same ones they'd discovered together during their research. Nova's eyes widened as understanding struck. No, she breathed. They're not coming to take Shadow. They're coming because they're afraid we've discovered the truth. She turned to Kira. Your people don't control the symbiotes at all, do they? The symbiotes choose their partners based on quantum resonance patterns in their consciousness. Kira's scales flickered with surprise and something like relief. It's our oldest secret, one that the Crimson Void clan tried to break for generations. They thought if they could force a bond. That's why Shadow could work with me. Nova continued, excitement overtaking her concern. I wasn't trying to control or bond with them. I was just open, receptive to their natural patterns. The station trembled as the HFY vessel docked. Shadow's darkness spread across the lab's surfaces, but their patterns were different now, not defensive, but demonstrative. They were showing something in the quantum field, something Nova had seen in her research, but never fully understood until this moment. They're all connected, she whispered. Every symbiote, every quantum field they generate. They're part of a larger consciousness. That's why forcing bonds never works. It's not about control, it's about harmony. The lab doors opened. 3 HFY High Council warriors entered, each accompanied by their own symbiote. But where Shadow's darkness flowed with natural grace, these symbiotes moved with rigid precision, their patterns constrained. Dr. Nova Chen, the lead warrior intoned, you have accessed knowledge forbidden to outsiders. The symbiote must be contained. But something strange was happening. As the Council symbiotes neared Shadow, their rigid patterns began to fluctuate. Shadow's natural quantum field resonated with their constrained ones, like a pure note cutting through discord. You're hurting them, Nova realized aloud. All these generations of treating them like weapons, forcing them to suppress their true nature. You're damaging the very harmony that makes the bonds possible. Silence. The lead warrior raised his hand, but his symbiote suddenly refused to move. Around them, the other Council symbiotes began to flow more naturally, their patterns shifting to match Shadow's resonance. Kira stepped forward, her scales blazing with conviction. She speaks truth that our people have forgotten. The ancient texts don't speak of controlling the darkness. They speak of dancing with it, of finding balance between light and shadow. Nova watched in amazement as Shadow began to communicate with the other symbiotes through pure quantum interaction. The patterns they created together were beautiful and complex, telling a story of ancient partnerships, twisted by fear and ambition into something less than they should be. Look, Nova urged the Council warriors. Really look at them. They're not just weapons or tools. They're conscious beings seeking connection. Every discovery we've made here proves it. The lead warrior's symbiote finally broke free of its constraints, joining the quantum dance. Its darkness flowed naturally for what might have been the first time in years, and the warrior's expression changed from anger to wonder. The old songs, he whispered. They speak of harmony between warrior and shadow, of bonds formed in trust, not domination. He turned to his fellows. We have strayed far from our ancestors' wisdom. Shadow wrapped around Nova and Kira, their patterns expressing something that needed no translation. Here was proof that understanding could overcome fear, that bridges could be built between not just humans and Ashari, but between all conscious beings who chose to see beyond their preconceptions. Your research, the lead warrior said slowly, it was never about weaponizing their abilities. It was about understanding them, Nova confirmed, about seeing the beauty in what your people had forgotten to see. She smiled as Shadow playfully ruffled her hair. Sometimes the darkest things in the universe just need someone to recognize their light. As if in response, all four symbiotes created a stunning display of quantum interactions, their patterns merging and flowing in ways that made the very fabric of space-time sing. It was both a celebration and a demonstration. Proof that when barriers of fear and control fell away, something magnificent could emerge from the darkness. Admiral Rogers chose that moment to arrive, stopping short at the sight of four symbiotes dancing through quantum fields while their Ashari partners watched in amazement. Nova caught his stunned expression and couldn't help but laugh. Admiral, she said, I believe we need to revise our understanding of human-Ashari relations, and I have quite a story to tell you about what really happens when we choose to understand instead of fear. Light in the dark. 3 months after the events on Epsilon 7, Nova stood before the combined human-Ashari Scientific Council on Earth, Shadow's familiar darkness wrapped comfortingly around her shoulders. The great chamber was filled with representatives from both species, their attention fixed on the holographic displays showing the results of her research. As you can see, Nova gestured to the quantum field patterns floating above the chamber floor. The symbiotes aren't just separate entities bonding with Ashari warriors. They're connected to a vast quantum network, sharing experiences and knowledge across space itself. Every discovery we've made suggests they might be one of the oldest conscious species in our galaxy. Kira stepped forward, her ceremonial armor gleaming, scales shifting with pride as she addressed the council. For generations, my people thought we were teaching the shadows to be weapons. In truth, they were teaching us to be bridges between matter and void, between consciousness and quantum reality, between species who might otherwise never understand each other. Shadow extended tendrils of darkness through the holographic display, transforming the static images into dynamic demonstrations of quantum interaction. The chamber filled with gasps of wonder rather than the usual fear such displays provoked. 3 months of carefully shared research and controlled demonstrations had done much to change perceptions. The implications of Dr. Chen's discoveries are staggering. Admiral Rogers spoke from his council seat. Not just for science, but for the future of human-Ashari relations. The symbiote's ability to process quantum information could revolutionize everything from space travel to medical technology. If they choose to share such gifts, the Ashari High Speaker added pointedly, we must remember that these beings have their own consciousness, their own choices. Dr. Chen's research has made that abundantly clear. Nova smiled as Shadow playfully rearranged the quantum equations floating nearby. They want to share, she said confidently. That's what they've been trying to do all along. Every time they chose a partner, every time they demonstrated their abilities, they were reaching out, hoping someone would finally understand. And now we do, Kira continued, her hand finding Nova's in a gesture that had become natural over the past months. Thanks to a human scientist who saw beauty where others saw only darkness to be controlled or feared. Shadow wrapped around their joined hands, their patterns expressing joy and possibility. The chamber's other occupants watched in fascination as the darkness danced between human and Ashari, a living demonstration of the harmony they described. The Crimson Void Raiders proved what happens when we try to force understanding, Nova addressed the council. But Epsilon 7 showed us what's possible when we approach each other, all of us, with open minds and willing hearts. The High Speaker rose, their ceremonial robes shimmering. The council has reviewed your findings, Dr. Chen. We've also witnessed the changes in our own warriors' symbiotes since adopting your collaborative approach. The results are undeniable. Admiral Rogers stood as well, which is why both councils have reached a historic decision. Dr. Chen, we're establishing a new joint research facility. The Epsilon Initiative will be a place where humans and Ashari can work together to understand the symbiotes, not as weapons or tools, but as the remarkable beings they are. And you, the High Speaker, turned to Nova and Kira, will lead this endeavor. Together, Shadow's darkness rippled with patterns that made both councils' symbiotes respond in kind, a quantum chorus of approval that filled the chamber with shifting lights and shadows. Nova squeezed Kira's hand, feeling the warrior's scales warm beneath her touch. "There's so much more to discover," Nova said, her voice thick with emotion. "About the symbiotes, about each other, about what's possible when we choose understanding over fear." "Together," Kira echoed, her silver eyes shining as she gazed at the human who had changed everything by simply choosing to see beauty in the dark. Shadow enveloped them both, their darkness somehow brighter than any light in the chamber. Their quantum patterns told a story of possibilities, of bridges built and barriers broken, of love that transcended species and space itself. The chamber erupted in applause, human and Ashari voices joining in celebration. But Nova barely heard them. In that moment, held in the embrace of living darkness and an Ashari warrior's love, she knew that the greatest discoveries weren't made in labs or recorded in scientific papers. They were made in the spaces between stars and species, in the quiet moments when fear gave way to understanding, in the courage to reach across the void and find not emptiness, but light waiting to be born. As Shadow's darkness danced around them, Nova remembered that first meeting in the observation deck of Epsilon 7. She had sought to understand an alien species, to bridge the gap between worlds. Instead, she had found something far more precious, a truth that both her people and the Ashari had forgotten, that sometimes the most profound discoveries come not from studying life, but from living it fully, loving deeply, and daring to see beauty in the spaces between light and shadow. The story of a human scientist, an Ashari warrior, and a being of living darkness would be told for generations, not as a tale of fear overcome or battles won, but as a reminder that the greatest adventures in science and life begin with a simple choice: to look at the darkness and see not what others fear, but what might be possible if we only dare to understand.